rising elites, these tech oligarchs and other similar figures, are actually creating their own little fiefdoms for themselves. In the sense that some of them are building retreats for themselves on remote islands. They internationally, you have these tax haven countries like the Cayman Islands and places like that. So they're actually creating these systems through which they can insulate themselves from any kind of institutional or popular retaliation. As far as models of repression, what was that movie years ago about some guy who, everywhere he goes, he's been sort of ostracized from society. He hasn't been put in jail, but his credit cards no longer work, and his phone doesn't work. I think it was that the Will Smith movie, Minority Report. I
You
think.
mean Enemy of the State?
Enemy of the State. That's the one. Yeah,
Yeah.
Enemy of the State. Yeah, it's. I think that model of repression is going to become more pervasive. Like we already have this concept called debanking. And we've seen that actually used against dissidents of different types. Like I think Laura Loomer, whom I'm not a fan of, but I think she's been banned from virtually all social media. I think she's banned from Uber, and some of these alt-right people were banned from Airbnb. But that kind of repression, where you're using economic and technological sanctions rather than direct brute state repression. Like when people think of repression, they think of stuff like dungeons with torture chambers and death squads, and that still exists. I mean, you have that in banana republics like El Salvador, and you have these medieval fiefdoms like Saudi Arabia that where they chainsaw a dissident journalist to death. But that, I think, increasingly in the more sophisticated systems in parts of the world, we're going to see more and more of this kind of repression we're talking about now, like the film Enemy of the State. They're going to more and more use that kind of model of repression, as well as just through massive surveillance. Like we already have these surveillance cameras everywhere we go, and these smart cities, I think, are going to be used for that purpose as well. And a lot of these tech oligarch guys are really big on developing these smart cities with this kind of AI-driven surveillance technology. So that's the model of repression we're headed towards. And I do think that there's going to be, as we've been talking about, a growing wave of dissident classes in the northern hemisphere. Not just in the West, but also in China, Russia, Japan, Korea, places like that, of this overeducated underclass. And this is going to become a new revolutionary force, along with the rise of the global South. And as the global South rises, as dissident classes rise in the northern hemisphere, and as non-state actors rise of various types, that is likely going to have the effect of pushing the nation states of the northern hemisphere closer together to defend their own collective interest. And what's going to be driving that is global finance capital. Global finance capital is going to recognize that they're being faced with insurgencies all over the place, and and the states that are largely under their control, they're going to have to bring those closer together as a form of collective defense. In Russia, for example, you have nowadays movements of people who want to fracture the Russian Federation into smaller countries, dominated by minority ethnic groups, particularly, say, in Eastern Russia and places like that. You also have demographic decline in Russia, in China. You've got similar ethnic insurgent forces in China. In the West, you see not only do you see the rise of populism, but then you also, on the more peripheral level, you see growing Islamist movements in the West and that kind of thing. So I think that all of this kind of stuff represents a future wave of revolutionary feeling or fervor that's probably going to emerge at some point in the future. And it's analogous to past things like that. It's going to be analogous to the Enlightenment era and the rise of the classical bourgeoisie. It'll be somewhat similar to the rise of the labor movement in the 19th and early 20th century, and also the kind of cultural uprisings we saw, say, in the 1960s, 1970s. Sort of a continuation of all of these things. I mean, we could even go back and find older analogies like the Reformation and that kind of stuff. So this seems to be a trend that's likely to develop worldwide at some point in the future against the dominance of global finance capital. and we'll see global finance capital trying to use technology and you know as a means of repression and maintaining control.
Well, but see, Keith, we know that's not going to work because that was the mentality in Afghanistan, and it just totally failed. Like totally failed. Florian.
Yeah. So one thing with our predictions that I mean, you said that representative governments can come back. That's possible, and that's maybe a bit of a weakness of these books like Sovereign Individual and maybe also Network State. The authors just look back on what has happened. With like history gives you very unique elements, so you have a very small sample size to make real predictions, and then they say, that these changes can take millennia even. So I think in the sovereign individualists still say that the change from the hunter gatherer lifestyle to the agrarian society, that agrarian revolution is still going on, right? So sometimes these things take part on a large scale, and the question is how useful is the model really to predict anything from it, right? Um, and with job automation, that is indeed a problem. It's always like there was this one guy, I've mercifully forgot his name. He ran for the Democrats, Andrew Yang, of course. Now I remember again, and he was talking about the problem with automation, and that was back in 2018, 2019, and it doesn't hasn't really manifested itself in some cases. People put too much hope on automation. It doesn't work quite as easy. For example, Tesla brought out, and other companies are now bringing out humanoid robots, like the Tesla one they call Optimus, and this guy can serve drinks, um, uh, can probably pick up, do gardening work, go to the store for you, repair your car eventually, and all these things. But for some applications, you can't use them. For example, I would like to have a tennis bot, the guy who always, like a robot who practices tennis with me, but it's too fast a game. So in that case, it can't work yet. So in some instances, also in daily life, robots aren't really that useful. So that makes automation also makes it slower, but also revolutions happen eventually, and then they seem to happen like all of a sudden, and everything was just taking place underground, right? So people think, oh, nothing has happened for a couple of years. Well, it may also mean that a lot of things are happening, but they are out of sight, and they're then like an exponential way. All of a sudden, they shoot up, go past the threshold massively. There's all these overnight events where people sold their company for billions, for example, overnight, but they worked in this company for 20 years, right? So change can happen. Things can become rapidly better or worse, but it's difficult to say, just because it hasn't happened yet, it won't happen. Now, on the other hand, when change goes on very slowly, then people can actually adapt. So when they got rid of the horse buggy by the advent of cars, they were able to get most of the people that worked on horse buggies. They got them to work on cars now, right? So it was slow enough transformation that you still had a way of getting all people still, you know, schooled into a new job. If like one generation fades away with a certain invention, and the new generation is like growing up with a new invention, like with the internet, then it's just the old generation just fades away, and they don't get immediately unemployed, right? So that can also happen. And I think humanity, as Scott Adams said, has a good track record of reacting to slow rolling catastrophes that we see from far away. We're able to work something out against it. But as I said, the caveat is that maybe sometimes change will come and will overwhelm us, but it's just you just don't see it yet. Now, one thing, when you talk about enemy of state movie and that level of repression, I would like to also point out that Adam Townsend on Twitter talked about that. He pointed the movie Dark City, and that's basically a movie. I think it came out 1 year before The Matrix, and it's kind of similar. So it's a society in which some people have overtaken that. Then the ruling class basically has found a way to stop time. every day at 12, time is stopped, and then people are placed into a completely different environment. So who had a family now sits there at the lunch table, all of a sudden now works in a factory, and people forget where they come from, right? So people basically don't have any past anymore because they're constantly moved around every day. And so that, of course, that's easy for the ruling class to rule their people, because if you don't have any past that you're bound to, then then you can be then you like a leaf in the wind that can be put wherever the ruling class wants to have you. And we kind of already saw that with the measures that were taken for COVID, right? We don't quite remember how it was before COVID, what kind of freedom we had, what freedom meant to us, right? It's all erased. So that we were gathering with people and outside, it comes back a little bit, but it's never going to be as strong as it was before everything was locked down and you had this stupid social distancing stuff. That's just gone. And maybe you could also say similarly, what happened before 9/11, that's just ancient history, like wiped away with like 1 year of effort, or maybe even say 1 day of effort, right? So, and that is a real danger, because that's the counter-revolutionary force for the government and for ruling classes to push against any attempts of people to find their own way. And that is already happening. And I don't think maybe we should look a little bit more closely on that.
Yeah, so I think at this point we'll lead into the final statements. But one of the things that I'm going to say is just that, again, I would agree with Keith that the elite is leaning into a more digital mode of controlling society, and that the sort of digital revolution, which began in the 80s, is really probably more important than even finance, capital, or the military industrial complex. I mean, it needs them. They all kind of work together symbiotically. But it's fake. It's a fantasy. I mean, the world that these people live in is a complete fantasy. And we know it's not going to work because the people who fought in Afghanistan in the global war on terror thought just like this. The Bush administration had somebody who said, we create our own reality. Well, it turns out you don't. It turns out the Taliban still rules in Kabul. So reality is not something that's going to go away. Now, I don't propose yet who is going to replace them, but this kind of thinking just can't succeed. And we know this because we saw this. We also saw this in Vietnam, right? The idea that you can wage war according to spreadsheets. No, that's not war. That's not how it works. And of course, that's how the Viet Cong were able to undermine, subvert U.S. influence, not only in South Vietnam, but even in the U.S. itself. I mean, obviously, the anti-war movement was not controlled by the communists, but the communists played into that, right? They took advantage of the situation. And so I think ultimately that this system it's at the high water mark, right? It's just like the Roman Empire at its height. It's at its high water mark, but then there's all of these cracks in the foundation that it refuses to see. So that's my final thoughts. Keith.
Well, one historical analogy that doesn't get mentioned quite a bit, but I think is appropriate, is to the overall trajectory that the Roman Empire traveled throughout its history. The Roman Empire was considered to have started when Rome was founded in 757 BC, and I think the formal date of the end of Western Rome is considered around 476 with the Vandal invasion. But if you look at the trajectory of Rome, it's very similar to the way the English speaking world has gone. If we say that the Norman conquest was really the equivalent of 757 BC in terms of the founding of what becomes this English world empire, and that of which the United States is a derivative, then the time period in history that would be analogous to the decline of Rome, like most historians will say, the decline of Rome started about 1,000 years later. It started in the roughly in the 200s AD, 300s AD, 200s AD. Well, that's about where we are now. We're about 1,000 years after the Norman conquest, just like 1,000 years after the founding of Rome. you started to see the decline of Rome, the major period of decline, and that's kind of where the West is now. If the Western hegemony, as it developed in the early modern period, was rooted in it starts with the Spanish and the age of exploration and all of that, but it's really the rise of England, British English naval power, and then the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of that in England, and it's spreading to